Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar, Compliance Effectiveness. Can you risk the risk? This webinar is presented by David Wentworth, Principal Analyst with Brennan Hall Group, and Donna Lord, Vice President of Marketing and Product Management at ePath Learning. Donna Lord has spent over 25 years helping companies from Fortune 500 to family-run businesses effectively market their products and services, expand their offerings, and achieve their business goals. As the Vice President of Marketing and Product Management for ePath Learning, she is the driving force behind ensuring new product development success. Donna works closely with customers to deliver their products that support their training initiatives and attain business goals. In addition, she stays at the forefront of the training industry to ensure that ePath Learning services provide positive, measurable results for customers now and as technology and methodologies evolve. This webinar is sponsored by ePath Learning. ePath Learning is a leading learning management technology service provider located in New London, Connecticut. Their technology enables organizations to easily deliver engaging training opportunities to their employees, partners, and customers worldwide. Their comprehensive suite of learning services includes their award-winning learning management technology, off-the-shelf content, and custom course design and development services, all backed by exceptional client support and engineering teams. While their services broad industry appeal, their primary focus is on regulated industries, specifically life sciences organizations, which require validated environments. And now, a little bit of background on Brennan Hall Group. We are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Our vision is to inspire a better workplace experience. We have world-class research, data, and expertise across all areas in human capital management. Currently, we have the following open surveys. These are in learning and development benchmarking, leadership development, HCM outlook, and talent risks. We would love to hear from you. If you participate, you could receive free gift cards, research reports, and more. To do so, please visit our website at brennanhall.com and click on Open Surveys. And finally, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. The playback and slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenters. And now, here's David so we can get started.
Great, thanks, Quentin. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. I definitely want to make sure that folks understand how to ask questions and use that question box, because we will keep an eye on that and try to answer any questions that come along as we're moving through. We'll also save a little bit of time at the end to answer any questions we didn't get to or any new ones that come in. And you can also use that just if you want to share any insights you might have or have any other commentary you'd like to share, feel free to do that through the question box. All right, so to get things started today, we just wanted to sort of get a sense of who's on the line today, who's on the call. And so to do so, the first thing we want to do is just launch a quick little poll and just see, in your organization, what would you say, how important would you say compliance training is to your organization? So, it could be that it really has no impact at all. I would imagine, given the topic of the webinar, few to none of you will pick that. But just to get a sort of level set on how important it is in general to the audience here today. And got almost all of you have participated. Another couple of seconds here. And okay. All right, that's pretty good. I appreciate you sharing with us. And so as you can see, Donna, we've got on the call, much as I might have expected, people who find that compliance is very important. In fact, almost half say that it's critically important, compliance training, to how they operate. So why don't you say hi to everyone, and what do you think about that this compliance training is so critical to so many organizations?
Sure, David, thank you. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, absolutely. We've been working with life sciences organizations for a number of years, and it is absolutely critical to them. And that's a major reason why they're starting to look at technology vendors like us to ensure that they are compliant and also make it as easy as possible for their organization to stay in compliance and keep track of that training.
Right. And so to that point, life sciences is what we would call in our research a high consequence industry. They would definitely fall into this category. I would imagine a lot of the folks on the line fall into some of these others, but essentially in our research, and I bring this up because you'll see this in, sorry, I don't know why, hold on one second, my screen sharing has fallen apart here for a second. Let me just get it back.
The joys of technology.
There we go. All right, you can see my screen again, correct? So the types of industries that we see in here, finance often faces a lot of regulatory compliance issues, aviation and healthcare, life sciences, the idea around loss of life and the other regulations that are in place. And so, for most organizations have to deal with compliance to some degree or another. And for many, it's simply just following rules or making sure that they're meeting certain requirements. But it can be for some organizations even up to a matter of life and death. If pilots aren't up into compliance, you could create massive safety issues, and so everything in between. So I wanted to bring this up and show this because in some of the research and data that we're going to share, we separate this group out to show what some of the differences may be in how they think about compliance given its criticality. So when you see high consequence, or it's abbreviated as high CQ, that is what we are referring to. So there's obviously no doubt about it that compliance is important, right? So if we look at our research and we look at companies overall, this is all companies, not just those high consequence industries. If we look at all of them and we ask them, how much of your learning budget is taken up by these various areas of learning and development? And you can see that about 11% of the budget on average is compliance regulatory training. And then if you can include things like HR legal, the different compliance issues that come with the HR department, or ethics training, which is very often considered to be part of compliance training, and that adds another 7% or so. So you can see that we're talking a significant chunk of the budget, about 17 to 18% on this. Now, if we look at those high consequence industries, we see there is clearly a shift. Compliance regulatory training just by itself, already 18.5% in the largest category of learning and development. And then you can add in the HR legal and the ethics portion, and now you're talking closer to another 10%. So you're creeping up on a third of the budget dedicated to compliance. And so if you take into consideration the implications of compliance, right, the risk mitigation, the prevention of things like fines or injuries or even death, things like that, and then you also factor in that companies are spending an awful lot of money, time, and energy in delivering compliance training to help keep them in compliance. It puts a lot of pressure on an organization to do this well. And so you can see again, if we look at from an investment perspective, when we factor out, okay, how much are we spending per employee per year? So for organizations in general, about 43% are saying they spend $500 or less per year on compliance training. And then you can see the other categories as they go up, with 15% or so spending more than $5,000 per employee per year on average. Now, when we look at those high consequence industries, there's a significant jump. Now you've got nearly a quarter of companies saying that they spend more than $5,000. That lower category shrinks significantly. So there's a lot of money being spent in compliance. So, Donna, I would ask you, in the work that you do, you obviously work with a lot of compliance-focused organizations. How much of an issue do they face when it comes to the budget and they have to spend money on compliance training? How often does that topic come up in conversation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. These organizations all know that they need to invest in compliance. However, with especially when you're talking pharmaceutical and biopharma, it's very interesting how tight the purse strings are. And so they absolutely know they need to invest in it, but it is a struggle. It's a high cost for them to
Right.
invest in compliance. So yeah, absolutely. They're on the higher end of the range in terms of what they're investing.
Right, and that's where the challenge comes in, is that often it's difficult to find the money, to spend the money, and so there's this sort of dichotomy against how critical the training is versus how much is companies are willing or able to spend, or time they're able to devote to it, because often compliance is looked at as almost secondary, and it's not as critical, and it sort of is invisible. So it's one of those things where when it's working right and organizations are in compliance, nobody seems to notice. But the minute you're not in compliance, it can be the difference between being in business and not being in business. So when we talk to companies about compliance training and how they think about it, we try to get them to think of it in maybe a little differently than they have in the past. So it's important to understand sort of the breadth and the depth of compliance. So it's typically one of the biggest training areas, simply because you can see in the budget allocations we showed, even in non-high consequence industries, it takes up a significant portion of the training budget. It affects a lot of the employees. Everyone has to take some level of compliance training at some point or another, but it gets the least attention. It's looked at as a necessary evil. The content isn't nearly as fresh and updated and as engaging as you might find in other areas of learning and development. I think organizations, they spend a ton of time creating like leadership development programs and crafting these elegant programs, and no one's doing that necessarily for compliance, despite how important it is. And as I mentioned, there's a huge cost of doing it poorly, right? It can result in fines, lawsuits, accidents. The business has to slow down because you can't operate in certain areas. So it's important to look at it very holistically and the impact that it has throughout the organization. Donna, what are some of the other things that the organizations that you work with, when they think about compliance training, what other things are they thinking about? What are some of the challenges they're bringing to you?
Yeah, so a lot of the critical areas that you mentioned, but it's also in terms of processes and procedure internally. It's not just a matter of the production line for a new drug to make sure that everybody is formulating it properly. It's also the processes leading up to that, meaning clean laboratory practices and how we store various components of those pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of different aspects that compliance training actually touches. So it's not just the critical end, but it's from the very beginning when you actually onboard an employee and everything they need to understand internally regarding what a compliant organization means.
I think a great example I run into from time to time that really illustrates this this dichotomy is in the healthcare industry. One of the most critical areas from a compliance training perspective is hand hygiene, hand washing, which in your mind seems to be probably the simplest thing, especially you're dealing with healthcare professionals. So this is something that should be pretty easy to address. The training that goes into it has been pretty straightforward and minimalistic. Yet when I talk to these companies, it's the number one issue that comes up from a training perspective. How do we get people to actually exhibit the behaviors and actually do this right? Because they're falling short. So it seems like such an insignificant thing on its face, the idea of properly washing hands, but it has such a huge impact on the organization and outcomes that it's sort of disproportionate, and the compliance training that's in place isn't necessarily meeting that need. It's more focused on the sort of trivial feel to what the content is, as opposed to the strategic impact that doing that properly has on the overall organization. So, it's not just money. We realize, you think of today's employees and how busy and distracted everyone is on a daily basis. And we asked, orgs, okay, so how often are people taking compliance training on average? This doesn't necessarily mean it's a specific schedule, but just in general, how often are they taking compliance training? And you see that for the overall general population, 40%, 41% say it's annually, once a year. And then there's a spread across other different frequencies, once a quarter, sometimes twice, maybe 3 times a year, whatever it happens to be. But it takes up a lot of different ranges the way organizations deliver, but typically they're doing it once a year, which again might not be the most effective or efficient way of delivering it. It doesn't change much when you look at the high consequence industries. They're a little less likely to wait till once a year. I think the criticality of the compliance means they're going to do it a bit more frequently, but even these organizations, 38%, are still doing it on an annual basis. So it's important to think about, is this something that we need to do simply because, like, think of it like performance management, right? We're only going to do it once a year because it lines up with merit raises and what have you. And that sort of defeats the purpose of performance management. So if you're doing your compliance training simply because it's a yearly audit or a yearly reporting feature, you're sort of missing the point of the compliance training. You're focusing it on that outcome, right? On the check the box outcome, as opposed to focusing it on, do people really understand why we're doing this and are they doing it properly? And then both groups tend to spend about the same amount of time in compliance training, which I think is interesting in and of itself, that there is no huge separation between the high consequence industries in blue and everyone else in the green. As to how much time they spend in compliance training. But the biggest group, half for each, is about anywhere from 10 hours a year or less, and then on up from there. But it doesn't necessarily increase. So what that says to me is, regardless of the type of industry that you're in, you really have to make the most of the compliance training hours available to you. And I don't mean hours in that it should always be measured in that way. Just the amount of time that you're able to connect with the employees around compliance training is finite, regardless of your industry. So even if you're working in a retail environment versus a life sciences environment, the amount of time available to the employees for compliance training is only so much. You can't continually add to that simply because there's more regulation. Do you find, Donna, that the companies are time constrained with this, and you can actually add to this too, and let me know if this is something you see, especially with the life sciences? Are there mandatory seat times for some of this compliance training? Like the regulatory agency requires that people spend an X amount of time in training.
Yes. Yeah, there's mandatory seat time, including down to, how long did you spend on a specific page within an online course. So, yeah, very, very stringent in terms of how much time they need to be spending in certain topics.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so with that actually eats into this time, because even though the time is mandated, that doesn't allow you to add more time per year to the training. So you have to figure out how you're going to work with those constraints as well. So some of the other considerations that we talk through with folks is that compliance is typically the very first learning experience that someone has at an organization. Once you get, it's part of the onboarding process, right? You might go through some compliance training from an HR perspective, from a legal perspective, and then even from some more, especially in the high consequence industries, you may have to go through some pretty rigorous regulatory compliance training in order to be able to perform tasks. So once you're on board, you have to show your compliance in order to even do the job. And it's very important to note that that's the first experience that people are going to have. And also at the same time, the most common learning experience that most people in the organization are going to spend some time in compliance training. So when you put that all together, we have to think about how are we delivering it, because I think the typical reaction to compliance training is people tend to find that it's dry or boring, not engaging, very much go through the motions. And if that's the first experience that you're delivering to people, then that's what's going to be in their minds for every learning experience that you want to deliver after that. They're going to just associate those together. So it's important to treat compliance training much in the same way as you would treat any other type of learning that you're trying to create and deliver. We want it to be engaging. We want it to be impactful. We want it to be relevant. So it's time to really start thinking about compliance in those ways if we really want it to be effective. So Donna, what are we looking at here?
So I had to have a dramatic image all of a sudden. So really this is about compliance programs and why we have them in place. Really, they're an insurance policy. And for all the things that you listed, David, in terms of, whether it's trying to avoid fines or product mistakes, or when you're talking in life sciences, it could be in terms of making sure that there's no issues with the end product or a medical device that could potentially cause death. And so when you're thinking in terms of compliance, instead of looking at it in terms of just the cost or the insurance premium, if you want to say it that way, you have to look at what the costs are if you take that risk and don't comply. And what we've found with our clients and in studies is that when you are non-compliant, those problems cost nearly 3 times as much as complying in the first place, as doing it properly in the start. So that's a really important statistic whenever we're talking with somebody that's concerned about the cost of compliance. Of course, everybody has a budget and we have to stay within that, but they always have to think in terms of, well, if we're not compliant, what's the cost of that risk to us? So when compliance discrepancies in business occur, regulators want to know 2 things. Generally, what they want to know is what process did your company have in place to prevent the discrepancy before it occurred? And what did you do once you realized you had a problem? Chances are that potential fines, warnings, or impact can be reduced if you can demonstrate that you have an effective compliance program. So that goes right back to what you said, David, in terms of, yes, there's compliance programs in place, but it's really important for those to be effective. If you could move on to the next one. Now, there's 2 main compliance challenges affecting most high-consequence organizations. That's both compliance effectiveness and audit preparedness. As a vendor in this space, and after serving many regulated organizations, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, I can tell you this, that we've found that those organizations that embrace compliance or have developed a culture of compliance outperform those that don't. In 2015 alone, 30% of the GMP warning letters, GMP being good manufacturing practices that were issued by the FDA were for data integrity deficiencies, and those referenced training issues or training requirements. So what we are finding is training is really a huge part of compliance. And so when our clients mention compliance effectiveness, what they're really trying to do is assess how effective their training programs are. And then when they talk about audit preparedness, what they're really trying to achieve is a constant state of audit readiness. And what I mean by that is that at any point in time, an auditor could walk through their doors and they need to be confident that they are ready for that audit without warning at any point in time. And those, for any organization, even if you're not in life sciences, you can imagine how hefty that challenge is, that at any point in time, you need to be ready for a potential audit. So, of course, you can overcome those challenges and streamline your administrative processes using technology. Of course, we're a technology vendor, and that's where something like an LMS can really help you on the training side of it. And though many of you in the audience may actually already have an LMS in place, if you don't, you certainly should consider one. But if you do, let me share this with you. What we often see as a vendor is that the LMS is underutilized, and it may be as simple as having your LMS vendor give you maybe an updated demo or an overview of new functionality to see what you haven't been using. And that is really key. If you're already paying for that technology, whether it's an LMS or even a quality management system, when you're paying for that type of technology and you're in a high consequence industry, absolutely push back on your vendor and utilize them and make sure that that technology is really helping you as much as it can, because the risk here is so great in your industries.
Yeah. And to be fair, the vendors only know as much as you tell them as far as what your needs are. And so as a learning professional, you need to be very tuned into the business and the compliance needs of the various parts of the business to make sure that you're addressing those so that you can go to a vendor partner and say, look, we need to have this type of validation, or we need to be able to provide this type of certification. Do you have the mechanisms in place to do that, to manage that, to monitor it, and to measure it? And like I said, sometimes there's a few degrees of separation between who owns compliance and the learning function. And then if you then add in a further level of separation to a third-party vendor, it can on the surface appear as though the vendor's not meeting the needs, but they only can deliver on what you've told them to deliver on. And so it's important, as Donna was saying, to have that conversation to see, look, here are our needs. Do you have something in place to meet that? And if the case is no, it's definitely time to start considering making a switch. And so
sure.
there's no.
I will mention, David, not to interrupt you too much there, but if you are in high consequence industry, whether it's life sciences or financial, some other, find a vendor that is an expert in that industry and those regulations, because that will help. We actually have newer biopharma companies that come to us, and they don't know all the things that they should know about the LMS technology and validation. So, that's where an experienced vendor in that particular regulation or regulatory industry would be helpful.
Yes. And so to sort of illustrate what you were talking about preparedness, and I think this is important, because, we asked organizations, are you currently, what's your level of preparedness for an audit right now, if somebody was to walk through the door? And you can see here, only 6% say, well, we're not at all prepared, which is not great. There shouldn't be anybody that's not prepared. But you have 55% say, well, we're somewhat prepared, and almost 40% saying thoroughly prepared. But if you really think about it, that 55% says somewhat prepared, they might as well be saying that they're not prepared, because there's really no such thing as almost compliant. When someone comes in, if there is an audit for whatever it happens to be, and not everybody meets the requirements or the record keeping isn't up, you're either in compliance or you're out of compliance. And the consequences of that are whatever they may be. Donna mentioned there could be some mitigation if you're able to show that you've got a path in place to compliance, and maybe you've got you've made some headway, but at the end of the day, you're either in compliance or you're not. So it actually looks like, a minority of organizations say that they're ready right now to meet their compliance needs. And that's, a dangerous proposition, depending on what organization or what type of industry that you're in.
Sure. And, ultimately what we're finding when it comes to audit preparedness, somewhat really doesn't cut it. Not with our customers. So as much as an LMS can make life a lot easier for when regulators come in and they're looking at your specific training records and reports, there's more to preparing for an audit than just training records. You can use your LMS to train your employees on how to prepare for an audit. That's a big one, David. A lot of customers, in a sense, forget that it's not just having SOPs and work instructions and all of these things that you can access and train your employees with. It's actually training them on how they prepare for an audit or respond to an audit. They need to understand how the inspection process goes. They need to understand how to answer audit questions. And when I say that, I don't mean not tell the truth. You should always tell the truth. But in telling the truth, there's also giving away too much information or getting into too much detail. You don't necessarily have to do that. So that is an important part of training, and certainly, technology like an LMS can help because you're automating it. Now, one thing we've also found is that if an employee has been trained and an auditor asks them a question and they don't know the answer, if at a minimum they know where to go to get the answer, then that will satisfy the auditor. Of course, if it's something that you're doing every day or on a frequent basis, an auditor would expect you to know the answer. But having some place, some resource, repository that your training resides in, if your employees are familiar with it and comfortable with it, they know they can go back to that repository to get the answer they need for that auditor. Also, managers and subject matter experts should also be prepared to address inquiries by auditors because they generally will be asked questions, and they'll be asked questions regarding employee responsibilities, training and procedures, And so understanding and preparing for the inspection will better enable your employees to answer questions effectively and truthfully. So don't forget that training on how to answer audit questions and how to deal with an audit is just as important.
Right.
Of course, also there's no amount of inspection-specific preparation or training that will ensure success if the elements that the inspector will assess do not comply with laws and regulations. So if you're actually, even though you might say that you might be training on certain things, if you're not actually following those processes and procedures, that's not going to save you in an audit. But for example, in the industry we focus on, life sciences, this means that our LMS technology needs to comply with those unique requirements set forth by the FDA. And so training is part of, since training is part of the quality system for life sciences organizations, our LMS is used to create, modify, and maintain electronic records and electronic signatures. Our actual LMS technology must be validated by each of our clients that it meets their intended use. And David, you had mentioned that before. We are a validated system. It means that we adhere to the regulations of the FDA regarding electronic records and signatures. But it also depends on our clients how they expect to use our technology. So we actually have to work through that with them, understand how they're going to use our technology to ensure that the way they're using it will also keep them compliant with the FDA. So it's very important there.
Yeah, and I think it just really, everything you're talking about illustrates that how compliance can't be a simple check the box exercise, right? So even being prepared for an audit, even if you think I've checked all the boxes, all of those elements you're talking about, the ability to, how do you manage an audit? How do you answer questions? How do you get, what does it look like? That's a whole other element that often doesn't get thought of because people have looked and said, well, I've checked my boxes, I'm good to go. And I think also the fact that you talk about a technology that, well, I've got a technology in place, but are you using it properly? And I think that's a big thing. Are you actually using it to address what needs to be addressed? So I think those are all great points. Thank you. So on the same token, Donna, you had mentioned earlier about the effectiveness and how organizations are measuring the effectiveness. And so you can see by the fact that companies don't necessarily feel as though they're thoroughly prepared for an audit, it might be not very surprising to see that they're not exactly super effective when it comes to delivering compliance training. We asked them, how effective are your compliance training efforts? Again, an even smaller percentage, only 2.5 say not effective. So not sure what those folks are doing at all. But there's nearly 2/3 say, well, we're somewhat effective, which again, you're either effective or you're not. You've either gotten yourself halfway there, 3/4 of the way there, 80% of the way there, or you're already there in that 34% that say it's effective. So what is it that's missing that's preventing you from being able to stand up and say our efforts are effective? Because they're not thoroughly effective. You have to fix something. There's something that you're missing, or something you're misfiring on in order to be fully effective, to make sure that you are fully prepared for an audit and ready to move forward. And so just one other point on the effectiveness from the research standpoint, when we looked at the companies that said that their training their compliance training was either not at all or only somewhat effective, 24% of them said they were thoroughly prepared for an audit. Whereas those that said they had their compliance training was effective, almost 70% said that they're thoroughly prepared. So it stands to reason that this would be the case, but we just wanted to share with you that the data bears this out, that if you have what you consider to be an effective compliance approach from a training perspective, you're far more likely to be prepared for an audit than if you don't. So this part becomes critical. So talk a little bit more about effectiveness and how organizations are sort of managing the compliance effectiveness.
Sure. So compliance really needs to be visible. To support a culture of compliance, people need to see the value in the programs that you're offering. And the way we can prove that value is to measure process and outcomes in order to engage the program's effectiveness and promote their success. So, simply said, gone are the days when we only measure employees based on training completion rates. Even though completion is still important, those completion rates don't let us know if our compliance training is actually effective. So using technology for compliance training, you standardize the training and ensure that the message is consistently delivered. It enables you to track performance against training to see if the training is having a positive impact. For example, if you're in manufacturing, you may see your rate of job-related injuries decline after annual safety training. And David, that goes back to what you were saying, that oftentimes that it might be once a year or annually that compliance training happens. Yet the rate may slowly increase again as time goes on. So this is an indicator that your employees need more frequent training or refresher training. If additional training is added to your program, then once again, you can monitor that correlation between the number of incidents of injury and time between post-safety training sessions. So this enables you to assess the level of effectiveness and determine any additional need for retraining. So it's not a just one and done. You have to monitor and use technology to help you see what the correlation is between when you deliver training and whether there's improvements in performance, let's say, or if there's a slip in that performance over time. And we need to put measurements in place that tie training to quality-related outcomes, like that previous example. But in addition, we can monitor tangible incidents such as workplace safety, product deviations, recalls, manufacturing line closures, and even process mistakes. We also need to know our employees understand our policies and procedures and are able to demonstrate that they have acquired the knowledge and skills to confront different scenarios. And that's a major one. That's one that you can't measure as easily, but if there are mistakes that in performance that are related to something that an employee is trained on, you can tie that back to the training and start to measure those results of those mistakes over time to see if it's a training issue or not. And of course, you can use your learning management system as it was intended to be. Something else we also see, a lot of customers over many years, and again, if you're not using the technology to its fullest, you're leaving money on the table, but you're also carrying an administrative burden that you may not have to carry. Because an LMS is a powerful tool, and it can help you manage your compliance training initiatives. It can help you with the measurement, and it can help you, track over time whether you need retraining or, maybe upgrade your training. When you have thousands of documents and hundreds of learners spread across multiple locations, the LMS can bring all these components together in a single system of record, and it ensures alignment and ensures transparencies. And it can really become a key component to maintaining regulatory compliance. Again, those customers we see that truly have a culture of compliance and use the technology find that it reduces their costs and it really does improve their compliance results. Also, I'm going to say, I know that some of you are out there and you're rolling your eyes and you're saying, all right, move on already. I know the benefits of an LMS. Well, I have to tell you, I hear this all the time, but when we've looked at the training programs and LMS utilization of many new clients and prospective clients, we find a vast number underutilizing the LMS technologies. Administrators and learning leaders are still relying on too many manual processes, and unfortunately, there are gaps in compliance efforts that could easily be filled using technology. So again, this isn't a plug for us, as EPATH. It really is for using technology, whether it's LMS and QMSs and other technology. Really push back on your vendor and get the most out of it. There's so many functions that an LMS can help with compliance. And, it can be as simple as running a report to see test scores for your employees. And then when you run that report, you start to get valuable insight into areas where perhaps your training might be confusing. For example, if you have a particular test and many employees are getting a few questions wrong on a consistent basis, then you can see that result over all your employees and easily go back and say, all right, is it the content of the training? Can we improve on that content? Or is it just the structure of the test question presented? I mean, a great example, I'll go back to David's hand washing idea earlier, in that we saw a client who had a hand washing video, and there was instruction. It was for food services. And in the training content, it said that you should wash your hands for 60 seconds. But in the test question, it said you should wash your hands for 1 minute. Well, the fact that somebody used 60 seconds in the content, but 1 minute in the question, that question was wrong 80% of the time. So, and it was just because you use different terminology, and you have to also remember your audience. So also let me talk a little bit about frequency. Yeah, we can't get more time out of our employees in the day. There's only so much. But there is really a good way to address that. And first of all, let me say that, you know, when you're talking about training programs, we are human and we forget. And, you know, we talk about here the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve on a regular basis. And that's basically that, you know, what we learn declines over time. And so periodic refresher training throughout the year can be helpful. But there's not a lot of time to do that. So, you know, there's an advantage to providing things like job aids or, you know, simple instruction to reinforce learned concepts. For example, refresher training that's delivered as micro-learning, perhaps a 2-minute video clip, or short simulation is far more appealing than a 60-minute page turner. So yes, you can increase the frequency of training without sacrificing your employees' time. And that's absolutely something that we do here for our clients as well, is really look at how we can make that training content more engaging and effective, yet keep it shorter, relevant, and succinct.
Yeah. And in so many things that just came up with when you were talking, and I want to try to touch on them. And there were a few questions that have come in. I think we've actually touched on some of them. So people, I want you to know, I see your questions, and we're going to definitely get to those. First, I think on the point that you were just making about the micro learning and the Ebbinghaus curve and using different modalities to keep up retention and push the knowledge forward. That's the one thing I see when I talk to companies when we're dealing with compliance. They sort of shut off when it comes to talking about anything other than a traditional class or a course, because they think, well, it's compliance, it's regulatorily driven, and we didn't even create the content, it's built by some. So they think, okay, I can't even begin to think about these new learning technologies or modalities when it comes to compliance. And that's farthest from the truth. The fact is, you can and should be trying to deliver in this way. And so this gets me to one of the questions, the first question that came in, and what are the benefits that can be gotten from doing training, say, once a quarter versus annually? So this ties into that, Robert, in that the more frequent, we're able to fight off that forgetting curve. And to get really specific on that Ebbinghaus curve, if you do just one formal training event, like a class, the curve theory says that within about 7 to 10 days, people will have forgotten upwards of 80 to 90% of what you delivered. So forget about the fact that now they're not in compliance because they can't remember anything that you told them, but all that time, money, and energy you did spend and whatever precious time of theirs you took to deliver it has gone to waste. So we need to find ways to be able to deliver that. And the truth is, when it comes to being in compliance, whatever your audit mechanism is, whatever it is within your organization that demonstrates that you are in compliance, right? Whatever that end result is, aside from meeting sometimes having a mandatory seat time requirement that you have to meet, but beyond that, anything else that you do from a learning perspective, it doesn't matter what it is, even though it's compliance driven. You could do whatever as long as it's effective and you're able to reach that end state that you're looking at. It doesn't have to be a traditional class or traditional course. It can and should be a whole host of things that make the learning more engaging, bring people in, and keep them engaged and successful. So the other thing that you had mentioned, that's why I wanted to move forward a little bit, Donna, is you were talking about the systems, right? And the way that companies are managing their compliance, and you talked about technology. So we asked companies to say, how are you managing your compliance? And companies could pick all of the three if they used some level of these. And so what it ends up saying is about 25% of the compliance that happens out there is being managed manually. And that could be, it's still often technology enabled, meaning like an Excel spreadsheet, but really it's somebody manually manipulating and working with the data. But it could even be right down to paper and pencil and charts that people are filling out and cards. And so given all the things that Donna's been talking about, that's a pretty scary prospect that this is how compliance is being managed, especially when it comes to audits and record keeping and being able to prove training has been completed and what compliance really should be. So there's a long way to go for companies to be able to be really driving forward to using technology in order to deliver compliance. So before I dig a little deeper into some more around compliance systems and delivering compliance from a modality standpoint, we touched a little bit on the one question about frequency. And I think, Melody, that we were able to answer your question about how they measure effectiveness. I think, Donna, you did a really good job talking through that. And I think that's a critical piece is, okay, in order to measure the effectiveness of compliance, on the one hand, you're actually kind of lucky from a learning perspective. There are a lot of other aspects of learning and development that are much harder to measure, because to try to understand what the end state should be, you're trying to change behaviors or improve performance. But at least in compliance, you know that here's where we need to be, here's where we are. And so, the idea of around accidents or whatever it happens to be, we want to reduce those. We want a number to go down or some sort of other number to go up. That's how companies are measuring. And that's why sometimes the annual nature of compliance is challenging, because so much can happen over the course of a year. It's hard to tie the learning to the change in results that you're looking for. But it's very important for whatever compliance program you're putting in place to start with a goal in mind, and to make that goal something other than making sure that we've completed the training, right? Because I think that's what happens in compliance a lot, is we just want people to get through it because they have to get through it. So to me, I'll use the example of, say, like forklift training. So it's required that you're able to learn how to drive a forklift properly and demonstrate that you can. So on the one hand, you could say, well, the outcome is that people have passed the forklift training, so we can just get to work. But to me, the actual outcome is, that there are fewer accidents, things are moving around the warehouse more efficiently, because those items are far more relevant to the employee than the box checking. So when employees go into training, the first thing they always ask is, why am I doing this? Why does this matter to me? And if you're presenting it in the sense that it's not important to you, it's important to the company, that's where that disengagement already begins right off the bat. But if it's, no, this is to help you be safe, it's to help your coworkers be safe, and actually, you know what? It actually makes us an employer of choice. People want to work here because they don't want to work at the warehouse down the street where everyone's getting run over by forklifts. They want to work here where it's a safe environment. So there's, this whole string of connections between the training and performance and the measurement that sort of all comes together. So when we're talking about different modalities, right, getting into moving beyond just the classroom and e-learning, we asked organizations, how are you delivering your compliance training? And you can see clearly classrooms and e-learning are the big ones, also virtual classroom, a bit of on-the-job training, which can be difficult in a compliance environment, because you can't, in many cases, you can't let it be truly on the job because there's really no room for error. We're seeing a real increase in things like, and you can see it at the bottom there, virtual reality or other types of simulations that allow people to sort of do more on-the-job type learning without any real consequence. But you can see here that there is a wide array of things that companies are using within delivering compliance, from delivering videos to having a coaching and mentoring framework in place, games, virtual reality, and so forth. And then we asked, this is what's happening today, and then we asked, okay, what are your plans in the future? And so you can see that there is going to be less attention paid to classroom. That doesn't mean there's going to be less classrooms necessarily. It just means the focus on how do we move forward and what do we create moving forward. It's going to be a less focus on the formal. So you see how those numbers are smaller for classroom, e-learning, and virtual. And then you see an increase in stuff like simulations, games, virtual augmented reality, those types of elements where we can actually put people in scenarios and really get them working through to see how the compliance training impacts what they're doing and what it means. So when you talk to companies, Donna, when they, as a technology provider, are they coming to you asking for this stuff, or are you sort of opening their eyes to it, or is it a mix of everything?
The smaller organizations, we're opening their eyes to it, as opposed to the mid-sized to larger organizations. They're already doing it, and they're pretty well set. But we have some of these smaller organizations that are spending a lot more time in classroom, and when we talk to them about other ways to deliver, for example, I think your on-the-job area is a great example where, we have, again, if you're talking about medical manufacturing, there is a manufacturing process. So there is a lot of on-the-job training that does happen. And there's not always consistency in there, because you could have one manager train one way, and then the next employee has the night manager and they train a different way. So what we've suggested is, in those cases, video. Half of us have, most of us have phones with some kind of video. So get those managers or whoever they are, supervisors that are going to train properly, and just take a quick video and throw that up into your system, and have, now, you should always have questions. There's other, reinforcement to that training, but at least those videos captures that on-the-job training, so you can expose somebody to it before they actually go and train on the job with another manager. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so just to sort of elaborate on that, you can see here some stats on what organizations are looking to do with learning in general. Like, this isn't just compliance training, this is learning and development overall. And these are the areas where they're looking, they consider these to be the highest priorities in learning in order for them to improve their business results. So they're looking to increase experiential and informal learning. They want to use new modalities, the smaller content objects, right, that allow you to drop learning in on a more frequent basis, make it part of the workflow, as opposed to these sort of annual events. So you can see the direction in which learning and development is going in general, and compliance really does need to follow suit. It can't just stay static and stay behind simply because it's compliance training. In order to be effective, all the reasons that make this effective for other areas of learning make them effective in compliance as well. And just one last bit on it, as far as what a modern learning environment looks like. These are the characteristics that organizations really need to start to wrap their heads around when they start thinking about learning, and even within compliance training. So it needs to be contextual. It has to make sense to the learner. Why am I looking at this? Or, is it based on my role, my location? Am I getting material that I've already demonstrated a knowledge of? Like, I don't want redundancy. That really turns people off when it comes to learning. The small bit, so that we can stop doing sort of annual event-based learning, or at least enhance the more event-based learning and give people quick updates, short videos to get what they need when they need it. Informal, right? There's always a conflict there when it comes to compliance. People are afraid to say something can be informal in a compliance setting. But really all we're talking about is allow me to access the knowledge and the information when and how I want, when I want, without a whole lot of scheduling, because I need to be able to fit it into my workday. Mobile helps. There are limitations here as far as when and how people can use this in a lot of situations, especially when it comes to hourly employees. That's something you have to figure out as an organization, what your strategy is. But the mobile piece, you can give. We've seen example after example of, like, say, manufacturing, where people are on a shop floor, very highly regulated, compliance-driven environment, and they can use their mobile device on the machines, like either logging in, so to use their device to prove who they are, so they can use a machine, right? So only somebody who's certified can actually turn the machine on. Or you can scan a code on the machine and get a quick tutorial on how to use it, or what's new about the machine, or how to fix it, things like that. And then the social piece, we again, this is something that gets shied away from in a compliance atmosphere, but the reality is it's relevant that allowing people to communicate and discuss the things that they're learning amongst each other really helps. It helps people. They open their eyes, so they get to see things that they maybe didn't see the first time they went through it, or when they look at it from a different perspective, and they're just going to learn more when they're able to communicate with one another. So with that, I just want to talk through sort of a wrap up of the things that Don and I have been talking about. That compliance covers a wide swath of operational and strategic needs. So it's not just many organizations have a very singular thought process on compliance, but it's much deeper and broader than that, and covers a lot of different areas. We mentioned how it's the first learning experience, so it's very critical that it's effective and engaging and getting people involved in the learning culture and the learning environment in the organization. There has to be some collaboration with the business units and the drivers behind compliance, right? So getting learning connected to whoever owns compliance, or the various, there's often different areas and different moving parts of compliance, having some sort of governance there that drives the learning, as opposed to the training just being generated in a vacuum. And then understanding what the regulatory reporting requirements are for your organization. I think, Donna, you mentioned a few things, but there are some very specific items, especially like you mentioned life science. There's what the CFR Part 11. There's other things, understanding what these items are, and making sure that you have tools and technology in place that address those. I mean, that's a huge issue, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And we have life sciences companies coming to us and saying, asking if we're validated, and we are, and then they'll name other systems they're looking at that are not. And, there's times it's like, okay, you really need to go back and make sure you understand that they don't have what you need in place. So yeah, absolutely. That's important. Make sure your vendors prove to you that they have, whether it's validation or whatever regulatory processes they have to have in place to support your business.
Right. And of course, the reporting and analytics side of it is important and actually critical, especially when it comes to audit and you have to demonstrate. You're going to want to have a tool that makes reporting and analyzing very simple. You want to be able to see what the compliance gaps are in the organization at any given moment, so you can address them properly without a whole lot of legwork. And that's where the reporting side and the analytics side of the technology comes into play. And then just overall, as much of this process as you can automate and get out of the hands of manual management, it just is going to improve the efficiency. And obviously we're all resource constrained. You saw the budget numbers that we were showing. Anything we can do to eliminate that constraint, and at the same time you're creating efficiencies. And the other idea behind the automated part of it is in a lot of cases you want to remove that human element so that that there is no issue around discrepancies or mistakes. And so anywhere that automation can take place, it's a good idea to look at that and see where technology can help. So with that, I'm going to go and look, and there's a few questions here, Donna, that I wanted to get, and I'll ask of you. So going back to the specificness of the health sciences organization. So does a health sciences company need a verified 21 CFR LMS, or do they just need to look for things like versioning that are part of the accreditation?
It's a great question, but it really depends on your organization. So you can be in life sciences and not require validation. But let's put it this way. If you could be audited as an organization by the FDA, then the answer generally is any of the technology providers you're using most likely need to be validated as well. There are some processes in the organization that don't have to be validated, and you'll have to look at that in terms of risk. So if there's, I don't know, if it's your printer, and the printer has no effect on your manufacturing process or the service that you provide, then no, you don't have to have audited software that runs your printer. But in terms of training, most likely, again, if the FDA could audit you, then your training records could be audited as well. Your LMS vendor should be validated.
And then another question focused on the validation process. What is the process for accreditation of a system for a particular regulatory body or industry? I don't know if that's too specific, but so I think someone's asking for what's the process for accreditation for a system?
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of a vendor, it depends on the regulatory body. So FDA, there are 21 CFR Part 11 are the regulations that pertain to electronic records and e-signatures. And those are the elements that would come into play with training records. So we know, and we've gone through training for this, that how to validate our system in support of that. Now, for financial services industries, there's other regulations, and it's the same thing. You would have to go and see what is the system you're going to use. If it's an LMS, you're talking about training records. What regulation is in place by that body that would affect those training records.
And this idea of whether or not the system meets regulatory compliance needs or validation, there's a lot of elements that organizations don't think of when it comes to technology. One that keeps popping up lately is around companies that operate in Europe, either completely or partially, if they're a global organization. And this is a GDPR statute now in Europe that says that people have to opt in to providing their personal data and information into a system rather than you collecting it by default and then having to opt out. And as part of that as well, they also have a right to be forgotten, that they can request that their data is removed from any of these systems. And so that's a compliance issue that doesn't speak to any one specific industry. It goes across all organizations, and it's something that companies are struggling with, and they need their vendors to be able to execute on this. So they're finding in some cases that the provider they're using doesn't have that mechanism in place to allow them to delete the data when requested, or it's not set up to not collect certain data by default. So you really have to take stock of your current regulatory climate and make sure that you're dealing with vendors and partners that truly understand what you're facing. I think we managed to answer all of the questions. We're hitting the top of the hour. I think, Donna, I'll leave it to you if you have anything you want to share as some parting thoughts.
Sure, absolutely. Again, throughout, I've mentioned, working with your vendor, and especially in regulated environments, you should absolutely push back on your vendors, ask the questions, find out what they know, and be honest with them. Say, I don't know what I don't know necessarily. For example, if you're talking about, certain regulations like the FDA, and push back on them. And if they're claiming to be experts in any particular space, they're there to help you and get the most out of your technology, because as David said before, this technology is there to help you. It streamlines the processes, and we see that auditors time and time again appreciate when they're doing an audit and technology is being used, because it's a lot easier for them to go through and ask the questions and get the results than reams of paper or Excel spreadsheets.
Exactly.
And yeah, thank you everyone for your time.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thanks for the questions. Donna, thank you so much for providing your thoughts and insights. It was a great perspective. Obviously, thanks to ePath for letting us put this on today. And we hope to hear from you guys in the future and see you at another webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Take care.